The last example of a market failure that we're going to look at is income distribution. And by income distribution, we simply mean how does a country distribute its total income? For example, in the United States, given our total gross national income, how do we distribute it? Does everybody get an equal share? How do we define income distribution? We usually look at income quintiles, and this is breaking the income levels up into 20% ranges. We do this by taking all of the income levels as reported on your income tax, listing them from lowest to highest, and then breaking those ranges up into 5 equal categories. Now the question is, how would we define an equal income distribution? Does that mean everyone in the country gets the same amount of money? I don't think any of us would argue for that. So, is the income distribution that we have a good one or a bad one? Well, let's look at the income distribution for 2019. If we look at the percentage of national income that each of the groups gets, let's see what happens. We see that the lowest 20% of the population receives 3.2% of our national income. The second 20% gets 8.4%. The middle 20% gets 14.3%. The fourth 20% gets 22.8%. And finally, the top 20% of the population gets 51.4% of our national income. Is this a good income distribution? Well, I think it kind of depends on where you are in this distribution. I'm fairly certain that the people who in the top 20% are saying that this is darn good. I'm not necessarily certain that the bottom 40% of our population is going to be very happy. Now, I've thrown in some other income figures here for you just so you have them for your own information. The median income, the middle income level in our society for 2019 was $63,030. The average income was $89,000, almost $90,000. In order to be considered part of the top 1%, you had to make $475,116. Is this good or is this bad? We as a society need to answer that question, because as a society, we've decided that this is not a good income distribution. But how did we come to that conclusion? Well, we use something called a Lorenz curve. Now, the Lorenz curve uses that data we just looked at. First of all, definition. The Lorenz curve is a graphic representation of income distribution. It's going to be a graph. You'll see that on the next slide. But in order to construct the graph, we need to use the income distribution figures that we just looked at. I just flipped the ranges here. But in order to graph the Lorenz curve, we need to look at cumulative percentages. And that's what this column here is. Now, in order to get cumulative percentages, we start from the lowest 20%. So lowest 20% gets a cumulative percentage of 3.2%. To get the cumulative percentage for the next level, what we say instead of 20%, what does this 40% of the population get? Well, 40% of the population, the lowest 40%, gets 3.2 plus 8.4, which is 11.6. The next cumulative level would be for 60% of our income, of our population. So 60% of our population gets 3.2 plus 8.4 plus 14.3, which is 25.9. And we do that for the 80%, they get 48.7, and obviously 100% of the population gets 100% of the income. Now, some of you may notice that 48.7 and 51.4 is a little off as far as coming to 100%. All right, statistical rounding. Okay. Now, in order to draw the Lorenz curve, we put the cumulative percentage of income along the vertical axis and cumulative percentage of families along the horizontal axis. And here's where those those cumulative percentages comes in. We go 20%, over 20%, and up 3.2, we'd be on this black line. We go over 40% and up 11.6, we're on the line. Over 60, up 25.9. Go over 80 and up 48.7. Go over 100 and up 100. So this middle black line here represents the Lorenz curve for the numbers we just used. Now, the closer the Lorenz curve is to the 45-degree line, the more equal our income distribution is. Remember what the 45-degree line shows us. The 45-degree line shows us all of the places where the value along the vertical axis equals the value along the horizontal axis. So the 45-degree line in this example is a perfectly equal income distribution. All right. So in this graph, and I've added a couple other Lorenz curves, this red Lorenz curve would represent a much more equal distribution. This blue curve would represent an income distribution which is much worse. We have less equality in our distribution. Now, don't these curves just make things so much easier to see? It's okay to say no, because I agree. When you put three curves together, it's easy to see which one gives you a more equal income distribution. But if you just looked at that black curve, is that good? Is that bad? Is that in the middle? It's hard to tell. So we need to use something else besides a Lorenz curve in order to explain our income distribution. Since the Lorenz curve by itself doesn't always clearly help us understand our income distribution, we have to come up with a mathematical way, a number, a clear number that tells us about income distribution. And that's something called a Gini coefficient. By definition, a Gini coefficient is simply a mathematical formula, a mathematical representation of income distribution. Now, let's take a look at a graph first, and then we'll come back to figuring out how we calculate the Gini coefficient. Now, I've gone back, I've drawn a Lorenz curve again, and it's just that black curve that was in the center. Now, in order to try to figure out what our Gini coefficient is, we have to use this graph. And all I've done to this graph, the difference between this and the previous one, is I've drawn a line down from the 45-degree line to the axis, out at 100. Now, by doing that, look what I'm forming a triangle here. So when we calculate the Gini coefficient, what we're looking at is the area between the 45-degree line and the Lorenz curve, this area in here, and we're looking at the area of the total triangle. Right? That's how we calculate the Gini coefficient. Now, let's take a look. The Gini coefficient is simply calculated by taking the area between the Lorenz curve and the 45-degree line and dividing it by the area of the triangle. In 2019, our Gini coefficient is 0.49. In 2018, our Gini coefficient was 0.48. Now, has that gotten better or worse? Well, it appears that the area between the Lorenz curve and the 45-degree line has gotten bigger. Let's go back and look at this graph again. For 2019, this was our this was our Lorenz curve, and it gave us a Gini coefficient of 0.49. If we put in the Lorenz curve for 2018, since its Gini coefficient is smaller, it's the 2018 Lorenz curve, the 2018 Lorenz curve would be someplace in here. It would be closer. So look what's happened. In a year, our income distribution has gotten worse. We have a more unequal income distribution. Now, let's flip back to this slide. The lowest Gini coefficient ever recorded in the United States was recorded in 1968, and that was 3.8%. As we can see, our income distribution is getting more unequal. So as a society, we weren't happy with this, and we decided we had to find a way of making our income distribution better. So we decided to play Robin Hood. We've decided to tax the rich and give to the poor. Now, how do we do that? Well, taxing, as you may recall from your macro class, taxing can either be progressive or regressive. A progressive tax is a tax that as your income gets larger, you pay a higher percentage of your income to the tax. Now, that's what we see with our federal income tax. It's set up in a way so that the rich pay a higher burden, which we as a society think is right. A tax could be regressive. A regressive tax is a tax that as your income gets bigger, you pay a lower percentage of your income to the tax. In this case, with a regressive tax, the poor pay a larger burden. An example of that is the sales tax. Now, while the sales tax is a flat rate tax, we all pay 7%. The reason why the sales tax becomes regressive is because the poor pay a larger percentage of their income to the tax, they spend more of their income, so thus they pay more of their income to the tax. Now, so that's how we take from everybody. And social programs, such as Social Security, welfare, unemployment, are ways in which the government gives money back. Now, in the next module or later this week, you're going to read the income distribution article. While you're reading that, pay specific attention to why each group feels we have poor. And then once we know why people are poor, what obligation does society have to help the poor? Think about those things, and we'll talk soon.